In the silent wilderness, the sound of squeaking echoed as a man furiously sawed through bone. This was the uninhabited region of southern Alaska, once a hidden paradise where the black-tailed deer family had lived for generations. However, today a visitor arrived uninvited. His name was Stephen, and he made a living through hunting. He had flown in, planning to spend a few days here with some supplies and a rifle. The first thing he did was set up a tent. The nights here were cold and windy, with temperatures dropping below zero. So he restrained his urge to go hunting up the mountains immediately and patiently set up his tent. Then, he loaded his rifle, ready for the hunt. Eager, he headed to the mountains, but the rugged terrain and the wind significantly drained his energy. After a short walk, Stephen felt a wave of fatigue. He looked around, trying to spot a deer, but the forest seemed devilish, with only bizarre trees and no sign of life. Frustrated, Stephen continued to climb. He enjoyed trekking and hunting on foot, exploring unknown areas which gave him a strong sense of conquest. Reaching the summit always felt like a reward. He was curious about what lay beyond the mountain. When he looked, it turned out to be more mountains, but there was a lake in the valley. He took out his binoculars to check for wildlife by the lake, but again, he was disappointed. Stephen found it incredible how deserted the place was, wondering where all the animals had hidden. He resumed his search. After a while, he used his binoculars again, and this time, fortune smiled on him. A deer appeared in his view, a robust adult male. Stephen's adrenaline surged. This target was his, and not even Jesus could keep it from him. He quietly set up his rifle, but the buck, sensing danger, became alert. Just as Stephen was about to shoot, the buck moved and hid behind some bushes. To avoid startling the deer further, Stephen did not shoot. Instead, he mimicked a deer call, which confused the buck. It looked around, sensed something was off, and hid. Stephen realized that waiting wouldn't yield any results, so he decided to take the initiative. Unfortunately, the weather turned against him. A sudden downpour disrupted his plans. The animals would hide from the rain, and he needed to find shelter to wait it out. Feeling somewhat disheartened yet persistent, Stephen continuously scanned the area with his binoculars. His persistence paid off when he thought he spotted another deer. Just as he was setting up his rifle, a sudden fog drifted in. Stephen felt bemused. The mountains seemed to have a soul and did not welcome him. He prayed for a change of luck, but the rain intensified, chilling his fingers. After sitting in the pouring rain for an hour, he realized that no good results would come that day. Picking up his weapon, he prepared to return to camp before dark. His descent was weary, and back at camp, the tent flapped loudly in the wind, indicating another cold night ahead. The next day, after the rain cleared, the air was filled with the scent of wet earth, and a beautiful rainbow promised better luck. Indeed, Stephen soon found a deer, but it was about 1,600 yards away. He quickly moved closer and saw the deer still nearby but alert to danger. Stephen ran to a higher point for a better shot. The buck paused, uncertain, giving Stephen enough time to set up his rifle and load it. He aimed and fired decisively, but the shot was too high, and the buck ran off along the mountaintop. Stephen felt regret for missing a great opportunity. After adjusting his emotions, he shouldered his rifle and resumed his hunt. But he saw no more deer. Reluctantly, he returned to camp. Before he arrived, the fog cleared again. He sat by the lake, watching for any deer that might come to drink, and his judgment was correct. Soon, a buck appeared. Stephen quietly set up his rifle, and the cooperative buck stayed in place. The deer fell to a hot bullet, and Stephen laughed heartily, having finally succeeded in his hunt. As he approached, he saw that the buck was large, yielding about 50 pounds of meat. With darkness approaching and only an hour left until nightfall, Stephen had no time to process the deer. He removed the innards to prevent spoilage and washed the deer with river water. After dragging the deer back to camp, he eagerly awaited daylight. Without hesitation, he began to butcher the deer, first removing the skin and then extracting a 7mm bullet from a wound. He separated the meat, packed it, and stuffed everything into his backpack. Fresh, organic meat was finally in his hands. He was ready to return home fully loaded, But first came the part he most looked forward to: tasting the fresh meat. He selected 2 prime cuts of tenderloin, tenderized them with a stone, and then set up a gas stove. He poured some oil into the pan and waited for it to heat up before adding the tenderloin. The sizzling sound was immensely satisfying. After a short wait, the meat was cooked. He picked it up with a small knife, and the aroma instantly filled his senses. Upon tasting it, he found the meat extremely tender and deliciously satisfying. This is why Stephen chose this lifestyle. He loved the delicacies of the wild. He was a true food lover, willing to venture deep into the mountains to hunt for fresh ingredients and satisfy his culinary desires on the spot. The sense of fulfillment deeply fascinated him. Stephen is a full-time hunter named Stephen, and today he arrived in the central region of Alaska. This area features towering snow-capped mountains, home to some black bears. Indeed, today his target was a black bear. Even such formidable predators were just another item on Stephen's menu. At this time of year, black bears primarily feed on blueberries, which makes their meat naturally aromatic and delicious. He parked his vehicle by the river and then entered this unexplored area using an inflatable raft. The snow mountain seemed close, but walking towards it, the distance was quite far. After some time, he picked up a dark chocolate-like stick on the ground, a remnant of bears eating blueberries. Nearby, he found some grayish hairs on a tree, indicating a grizzly bear, not the black bear he was after. So, he continued on. Not far ahead, he spotted a large paw print, definitely left by a grizzly bear. Stephen did not want to encounter a grizzly, known for their size and aggressiveness, capable of easily mauling a person. He proceeded with caution, hiking up the mountain alongside a small creek and occasionally using his binoculars for scouting. Unexpectedly, he spotted a black bear in his view, which instantly excited him. Seeing the well-fed black bear, he could hardly control his excitement and began to climb towards its location. However, the steep and uneven mountain path slowed him down. But when he saw fresh berries, he knew he had entered the black bear's territory. He also spotted several mountain goats on the steep mountaintops, formidable in their own right. Although goat meat was also tasty, his target this time was the black bear. Farther up the mountain, he saw a moving black bear. Stephen wasn't sure. He wasn't sure if this was the same bear he had seen before, and it was easy for him to be spotted. While Stephen hesitated, he suddenly saw another bear halfway up the mountain. Now his target was clear. He quickly pursued it. After much effort climbing to a high slope, he looked down, and indeed, the bear was still there. Although it was within shooting range, Stephen did not shoot because the black bear was on the edge of a steep cliff, with a deep canyon below. If its body fell into it, whether he could retrieve it was uncertain. After hesitating for a moment, he decided to give up on this target. Unexpectedly, the black bear began to move down the mountain. This might be a rare opportunity, so Stephen quickly descended, and the black bear also sped up. It looked likely that they would meet somewhere. In this tense atmosphere, Stephen kept a close watch on the target. He finally found a vantage point, and just as the black bear stopped, a bullet tore through the sky and struck the bear. In pain, it started to run wildly, but the bullet had hit a vital spot. The bear stumbled and fell, rolling down a few times. Stephen sat down to stabilize his excited emotions, then slowly approached to confirm the bear was dead. However, the sun was setting fast, and he had to make a tough decision: to leave the bear's body there and come back after dawn to handle it. He still needed to promptly remove the organs to prevent bacterial growth. After saying goodbye to the bear, he started his return journey. The Northern Lights, one of the most beautiful sights in the world, graced the sky as he admired the view on his way back to camp. The night passed quietly, and as dawn returned to the land, he was already on his way back. The area was known for its wildlife, and he saw crows flying overhead, which made him uneasy. Crows often appear at scenes of carnage. Stephen had to quicken his pace. Using his hands and feet, he finally arrived at the scene. Thankfully, the black bear was still there. Relieved, Stephen immediately began the butchering process. The air was thick with the scent of blood, which could attract the attention of grizzly bears. Although the black bear primarily fed on berries, it had accumulated a thick layer of fat. Stephen felt the greasiness on his hands, which he liked. After returning, he could render this fat into animal oil, which was healthy and tasty to eat. In his view, this fat was a treasure not to be discarded. After some time, he packed the meat into categories, loaded his backpack, and headed back to camp. Carrying the heavy load made the descent particularly careful. He drank from a mountain spring when thirsty and rested when tired. Finally, after 2 hours, he returned to camp. The next part was what he most looked forward to. He started a fire and then opened his pack. He tore off 2 small pieces of fat, sliced them like sushi, and cut them into smaller pieces before placing them in a pan over low heat. As the fat slowly rendered out, it was time to add the meat. He cut a bright red piece from the thigh, sliced it into thin strips, and added them to the pan. As the temperature rose, the oil began to bubble. After waiting a bit, the meat was cooked. Picking up a piece, its dripping oil was tantalizing. Stephen opened his mouth wide and popped the meat inside. After a few chews, a rich aroma spread through his mouth, a taste so divine it seemed heavenly. Stephen was deeply indulged in the experience, ready to feast heartily today. The black bear's body was full of thick fat, from which high-quality animal oil could be extracted. Stephen had hunted a black bear and made a delicious dinner, satisfying his appetite thoroughly. This time, he traveled to a wetland in north-central Alaska. Due to the complex terrain, the only ways to reach this place were by plane or boat, and Stephen chose both. His friend Brant, a waterfowl biologist, had been waiting there for some time to conduct avian flu research. After greeting each other, they set off. Their first task was to find a location because wild ducks have specific activity areas. Their method was simple: wander around to see where they might startle a flock of ducks. As they ventured deeper into the water, the engine's roar caused a spectacular scene of ducks taking flight in haste. They chose a spot near the shore and started building a blind. They formed a circle with wire mesh and camouflaged it with reeds, placing it near the lake's edge. Then, they threw pre-prepared duck decoys into the lake. Ducks, being social animals, naturally gather where they see others. Now, the lake surface was dotted with many decoys. They set up a wire mesh barrier in front and sat behind it, waiting quietly. After a while, ducks began to appear in the sky. An excited duck came close, and Stephen stood up to shoot, but forgot to disengage the safety lock. Startled by the noise, the duck flew away, leaving Stephen quite embarrassed. After this mishap, some time passed without any ducks appearing. They concluded that their location was too close, so they moved the barrier to a farther position. This strategy proved effective, and soon a wild duck glided down. Stephen quickly stood up. He fired a shot, but unfortunately missed. Quickly, a wild duck fell into the water. Brant sent his dog to retrieve it, and soon it brought back a duck. Stephen had bagged his first catch of the day and couldn't stop smiling. Getting the first one meant more would soon follow. A timeless truth. Indeed, another duck soon appeared. Stephen, now understanding, took a steady shot and hit his target. The dog handled the retrieval again, and several more ducks appeared. This time, Brant was active too, showing off his shooting skills. The two men grew increasingly excited by this thrilling hunting method. Gunshots echoed continuously in the wilderness, with the dog working the hardest, running back and forth. Brant had a whistle that mimicked duck calls, drawing ducks continuously. The two men started getting creative, waiting for several ducks to gather before surprising them with a shot, catching them off guard. The joy of men is simple: just aim and shoot. After a while, they had collected a total of 8 ducks. As it was getting dark, they were about to end the day's hunt when another duck flew by. Stephen couldn't pass up the opportunity and fired again. He hit the target, but didn't kill it. He ran to the shore to take another shot, but missed, and he had run out of bullets. He had to borrow one from his friend. By the time he reloaded, the duck had disappeared. They couldn't leave the wounded prey, So Brant brought the boat over and they started searching. Unfortunately, after a thorough search, they couldn't find the duck and had to give up reluctantly, taking all their belongings and heading back. The next day, they set out early before dawn, but luck was not on their side. Shortly into their journey, the boat's motor died. Brant tinkered with it for a while but couldn't get it started. They took it apart to inspect and found a lot of water in the filter. They opened the end of the filter, emptied the water, and tried again. This time, the motor started, and they continued their journey. After a while, they finally reached their destination. They set up various equipment, and by the time they were done, it was already light. They had just sat down when 2 ducks flew by, one for each of them, but coincidentally, they both missed. Perhaps because the cold had numbed their hands. While waiting, Brant continuously mimicked duck calls. Soon, an eager wild duck approached. Seeing the 2 men stand up, the duck tried to ascend and escape, but was still hit by a bullet. The dog quickly retrieved the prey, a fat mallard, its body plump. The meat was exceptionally delicious. After setting up, the 2 men entered hunting mode and began to take down game from all directions. Some birds luckily escaped, but solitary ducks often weren't so fortunate and met their end. The dog, transformed into a diligent worker, kept fetching the ducks. With the impressive teamwork between the 2 men and the dog, their collection of ducks visibly grew. After a while, feeling they had enough, they stopped hunting, packed up their gear, and took the dozen or so ducks they had hunted back with them. Before enjoying their feast, they had important tasks to handle. Brant needed to collect some samples to monitor for avian flu. While he was busy with that, Stephen started plucking feathers. After plucking, he gutted and cleaned the ducks in the river. They decided to cook 2 ducks. The method was simple. They made a cut along the back, inserted the knife, and carefully sliced open the breastbone along the spine, then flattened the duck by force. Next, they made a cooking rack. They drove it into the ground, threaded willow branches through the duck's body, and hung it on the rack. A makeshift grill was ready. Under the charcoal fire, the duck slowly cooked, becoming crispy on the outside and tender inside. Stephen had to be careful to turn the ducks to avoid charring them. When Brant arrived, the duck was just about done. They began to taste their creation. This primitive cooking method often yielded unexpectedly delicious results, almost making them forget themselves. The aroma of the roasted duck deeply tantalized their taste buds. However, during the meal, they had to be cautious of lead shot. Amidst laughter and enjoyment, they devoured the duck. Poor the dog, busy for 2 days, only got a small share of the meat. Is this the lifestyle you aspire to? Imagine inviting a friend, roasting ducks over a charcoal fire in the wilderness, with ingredients sourced from nature, enjoying the pure flavors. Stephen is a full-time hunter who sustains himself through hunting. This time, he is in the northern mountains of California, where Eurasian wild boars are becoming a nuisance. He has a friend who runs a ranch there. Stephen consulted him about the situation. His friend, greatly troubled by the wild boars, expressed frustration and helplessness. They dig everywhere and even break into barns, seemingly endless. Finding wild boars is simple. Just look near water sources, a daily necessity for them. Equipped, they drove out, knowing that hunting these fierce and cunning boars comes with significant risks. His friend drove him to a forward cabin to avoid scaring the boars with the engine noise. Before setting off, he needed to load his bullets and take all necessary precautions. Only then did he officially enter the wilderness. Stephen walked slowly, constantly observing his surroundings and occasionally using his binoculars. The forest had some oak trees, a primary food source for wild boars, indicating that this area was active with wild boar. Stephen tried to find a water source nearby, and from a vantage point, he spotted a small stream in the valley. As he got closer, he saw various signs of wild boar damage. He identified a winding animal trail nearby and followed it uphill. Entering the forest, he was startled by a noise ahead. Crouching down, he looked and saw leaves moving in the bushes ahead. He held his breath, and waited quietly, but the silence gradually returned. It seemed the wild boar had run away. This is what happens when a hunter is detected too early. To hunt successfully, gaining the upper hand is crucial. For the rest of the time, Stephen didn't see any pigs, though he did spot a few deer. However, since his target was wild boar, he chose not to disturb the deer. As dusk fell, he had no choice but to return to camp and wait for daylight to try again. The next day, he went to a high point and used his binoculars again, but still saw no targets. So, he started wandering around, heading southeast for about 3 miles until he finally spotted something. He quickly used his binoculars and saw a wild boar running like a startled rabbit, with another nearby. Observing their direction, he felt they might be heading to the spot he discovered the previous day, where the boars slept. Now that he had confirmed the wild boar's patterns, but as it was noon, he decided to shoot a quail to fill his stomach. With his marksmanship, he could kill in one shot. He admired the quail, then tucked it into his pocket and gathered some dry wood. Back at camp, he looked for usable tools and modified an oil drum into a stove, key for forest fire prevention since he couldn't risk burning down his friend's ranch. He then plucked the quail, tied it with a wire, and hung it above the oil drum to roast over charcoal. Half an hour later, the aroma spread, and Stephen couldn't wait to taste it. The meat was tender and delicious, greatly satisfying him. After eating, it was time to hunt the wild boar. Though wild boars have a keen sense of smell, their vision is poor. Therefore, by paying attention to the wind direction and approaching slowly, he could get close to his target. Before setting off, he might catch a wild boar asleep. Getting closer, he could smell the boar's stench. Walking further, he spotted the boar. He raised his gun, aimed briefly, and decisively fired. Accompanied by the boar's screams, it bolted. Stephen didn't rush. He walked forward to check for blood traces. He found some and followed the trail, which revealed more blood along the way. The wild boar lay not far ahead, dead. Stephen, delighted, looked at his prey, a fat and robust boar with a large, old razorback covered in thorns, looking fierce and majestic. After reflecting, he dragged the boar to a nearby creek to process it. He started by slicing along the belly to remove the organs. Then, he cut a branch from a nearby tree, tied the boar's neck to the branch with a rope to create a makeshift sled, and began dragging the boar back. It took some effort to reach camp, but he didn't rest and immediately started butchering. He drilled holes in the boar's legs, tied them with ropes, and used a large rock to stabilize the oil drum so the boar could hang. He quickly set up a butchering frame and skinned the boar, then cut the meat into categories, starting with his favorite part, the loin. Wild boar, unlike domestic pigs, have more lean meat due to their active lifestyle. However, the thigh meat is still excellent white meat for other animals. Now that the butchering was done, the next step was what he looked forward to the most. He found an old iron sheet, shaped it into a bowl, and lit a fire on it. Then, he took out some aluminum foil, placed the loin on it, sprinkled some salt, and added a sliced apple and onion for a balanced meat and vegetable dish. He carefully wrapped it and placed it on the charcoal, covered it with an iron plate, and weighed it down with a stone. After waiting half an hour, Stephen eagerly checked it. He opened the foil, and the aroma instantly hit him. The meat looked and smelled delicious. He cut a piece, chewed it, and the lean, tender pork melted in his mouth, tasting superb with apple and onion. Truly a human delicacy. This enticing scene even excited the nearby dairy cows. They too wanted a taste. But there wasn't enough for Stephen, let alone to share with them. After eating his fill, he would go to his friend's house to share the remaining pork. Today, he arrived in the southeastern mountains of Arizona, home to a type of deer known as the Coues white-tailed deer. These deer are smaller in size, with bucks weighing around 100 pounds, making them a challenging target for hunters, which ironically attracts a lot of them. The terrain here is mostly rolling hills, often referred to as Sky Islands, because of their unique characteristics. Stephen enlisted the help of a local friend who knew where to find white-tailed deer. They reached a high point and set up binoculars to watch and wait. After some time, a deer appeared in their view with another behind it. Stephen hadn't noticed any, but his friend's keen eyesight spotted the elusive Coues deer. After briefing Stephen, his friend left, and Stephen continued the hunt alone. He moved to a mountaintop and resumed observation, but the deer, small and well camouflaged, remained hidden among the uniform landscape below. Stephen had no luck that day and left as night fell, finding a place to stay overnight at the mountain's base. The next morning, before dawn, he set out again, this time changing his strategy to a mid-slope location that allowed views both up and down the hill, hoping for a surprise find. As the sun rose, he had been observing for a long time but saw no sign of deer. Preparing to move, he hadn't gone far when it started to rain. Fortunately, he had brought a raincoat, which he donned to continue onward. The weather here was unpredictable, and soon after, the rain cleared. However, Stephen hadn't found a new observation spot yet. He overcame many obstacles to reach another high point and went back into stealth mode. Despite the thunder, his focus was undisturbed, and his efforts were finally rewarded when he spotted deer, pairs of Coues deer. But he remained seated. A formidable canyon separated them, presenting a bittersweet scenario. As darkness fell, he returned empty-handed again. After 2 days of disappointment, Stephen felt very down and forced himself to sleep. The next day, as dawn broke, he resumed his work and soon spotted 4 white-tailed deer on the move. Approaching them hastily could easily spook them, so he tried to figure out where they might settle for the night. However, the situation soon spiraled out of control as the sun rose and directly shone in his direction, making it impossible to continue monitoring the deer. Now, he could only leave it to chance. As the sun rose high, Stephen resumed his observation and unexpectedly witnessed a dramatic scene. 2 deer were fiercely fighting, as if it were a life-or-death battle. Stephen watched amusedly, imagining a melodramatic family drama unfolding before him. After the excitement, he felt he had observed enough and decided to take action. He needed to cross 2 canyons, the second resembling the entrance to hell, daunting to even look at. While walking, he suddenly stopped. A rattlesnake was glaring at him from the ground. Stephen picked up a rock and forcefully smashed it, sending the snake to its demise. He collected the snake, thinking if he couldn't catch a deer, snake meat would have to do. He then approached the second canyon, which was treacherously steep. He had to be very careful descending. An injury here could be disastrous. With heightened focus, he overcame numerous challenges and finally reached the bottom of the valley. But the journey wasn't over. He had to climb along the wall to the top. Fortunately, the slope was gentle enough to function like stairs. After a grueling effort, he emerged from the canyon. As soon as he did, he spotted 2 deer, but he was downwind, and with the deer's keen sense of smell, catching up was impossible. As evening approached, he decided to camp there for the night. Dinner was, of course, snake meat. He cut the snake into pieces, boiled them in water, and added some chili peppers, significantly enhancing the flavor. After a modest meal, he fell asleep. The next day, his 4th in the area, Stephen resumed his work. Being in a deer-active zone, he soon spotted one, although it was quite far. He decided to approach quietly. Not far into his stealthy advance, he saw a limping deer in the bushes ahead, likely a loser from the buckfights. Approaching, he crouched and aimed, intending a humane, clean kill. The opportunity came quickly, and he decisively fired. Approaching slowly, he found the buck had already stopped breathing. Excited, Stephen patted its belly. The buck was just at adulthood, likely to have tender meat. He dragged the deer to an open area and began the butchering process. Among the deer's organs, he found a lace-like tissue, which he used to wrap the deer's heart to keep it fresh. After butchering, he moved on to the part he most anticipated. He gathered some stones to build a makeshift stove and lit a fire inside. Today's recipe was an ancient one, called deer heart corn cakes. He took out the materials and saw that the fat used for wrapping had dried a bit, but it was better at enclosing the heart. He inserted a stick directly into it and placed it over the charcoal fire. After a moment, drops of animal fat began to fall, sizzling on the coals. The outer fat started to char, but the heart inside was gradually cooking. Watching this, Stephen's mouth watered. He resisted the urge inside and patiently waited, then took out 2 prepared cakes. After a short while, feeling the time was right, he sliced open the outer layer to reveal the tender heart, steaming hot. He sliced the heart, carefully placed it on the cakes, added some onions and a few hot peppers for flavor, and the most crucial ingredient, a secret spicy sauce. He rolled up the cake and took a big bite. The taste was incredibly satisfying, and he fell deeply in love with this culinary delight. After eating his fill, he packed up his trophies and started his return journey. A man named Stephen, a full-time hunter, had hunted a white-tailed deer. From between its organs, he extracted a lace-like fat tissue, wrapped it around the heart, inserted a stick through it, and roasted it over charcoal. Once it was crisply tender, he placed slices on corn cakes, added some toppings, and enjoyed a hearty meal. This time, Stephen came to the Big Bend area of Texas, one of the world's most rugged places. Here lives a type of mountain goat, one of the hardest animals to capture. Known as the Barbary sheep, originally from North Africa, they were later brought to the United States and have settled in these mountains. Stephen's plan was to find a safe shelter first, and he was in luck to quickly find a natural cave. From the remnants inside, it appeared someone had camped there before, easing his worries about shelter. He shouldered his backpack, armed with a rifle, and entered work mode. As he walked, he used his binoculars to scout the area. Though he hadn't spotted any game yet, he knew his destination was the steep mountain peak ahead. After a grueling climb to the top, what he saw was goat droppings. Clearly, he was in the right place. This was the goats' active area. Stephen began to study the tracks on the ground, trying to determine their direction. Unfortunately, the tracks were too complex and he couldn't figure it out. He took out his binoculars again for another look, but all was silent around him, with no sign of animal life. This unexpected quietness in the wilderness was something new to him, as the day slowly turned to dusk. Reluctantly, he ended his hunting for the day. The next day, as the sun rose, Stephen set out again on his quest to find goats. Today, he finally saw some wildlife, which greatly improved his mood. He carefully climbed to the top of the mountain and made an unexpected discovery: a large patch of blood on the rocks, likely left by a bird of prey tearing apart its prey. After reflecting on this, he took out his binoculars to observe. As time passed, his eyes grew tired, but he still saw no goats. It seemed this method was not working, and he also started to feel hungry. He had seen some quails earlier, so he switched to a shotgun designed for bird hunting and began searching the area. After a while, he spotted a quail and shot it with one clean hit. He quickly ran to pick up his catch, thrilled with the small creature. He immediately set up a fire and thoughtfully removed its feathers. Pulling out an iron pot, he knew that the right side dishes were key to a good meal. He prepared sweet potatoes, onions, and peppers, using animal fat as oil. He stir-fried these side dishes first, and when the heat was just right, he added the whole quail and covered the pot, patiently waiting. Half an hour later, he added some salt, chili, and black pepper to enhance the flavor of the meat. After a little while, when the quail was ready, it looked delicious. But Stephen, adhering to the principle of saving the best for last, started with the onions to stimulate his taste buds. Only after that did he begin to slowly savor the quail, appreciating its tender and excellent texture, his highest praise for the dish. After eating his fill, he went back to observing. Perhaps his luck had turned, as he finally spotted goats in his view, a whole family of them. Stephen was nearly moved to tears. He had been waiting for this moment for 2 full days. He crouched down and quietly approached the goats, which began moving towards the valley. Stephen calculated the situation. He couldn't blindly follow as dusk was approaching, and he didn't have much time left. Although they were still a bit far, missing this opportunity might mean not encountering goats again tomorrow, so he considered taking a risk. However, after aiming for a long time, his rational mind prevailed. The sun was setting too quickly, and he could not ensure a clean, humane kill. He did not want the animal to suffer a painful death if wounded. Returning to the shelter, he had a tough night. The next day, the weather suddenly worsened, accompanied by howling cold winds, an unfavorable condition for Stephen's hunting. Yet, unexpectedly, just after a short period of observation, he found a goat, which appeared to be a young male, possibly ousted by its group. Stephen rushed towards it, and as he got closer, he began to crawl forward to avoid alerting the goat. Despite his careful approach, the distance between them widened again as the goat moved on. Stephen was puzzled until he saw a few more goats appear behind it. He realized that these goats were chasing away the loser in front, inadvertently ruining his hunt. At this point, he decided to go all out, climbing directly to the mountaintop to see if he could encounter any lucky individuals. The mountain path was extremely steep, and a slight misstep could be fatal. With cautious maneuvers, he safely reached the summit. He took out his binoculars and spotted several goats moving towards a higher peak. The opportunity was right there. Stephen crouched down and aimed, but the high winds and the goats' fast movement made it impossible to find a shooting opportunity. Reluctantly, he had to give up. The severe weather was disastrous for hunting. Although unwilling to admit defeat, he had to accept that this hunting trip was a complete failure. Stephen had managed to catch a quail, plucked and skinned it, prepared side dishes first, then cooked the quail with various seasonings, creating a delicious roasted dish. Stephen is a full-time hunter, but his plan to hunt goats ended in failure. Unwilling to leave just yet, he shifted his focus to another animal, the Sierra pigs. These animals are small, with male pigs averaging around 50 pounds, known for their toughness and ferocity. Given the close proximity to the Mexican border, an area active with drug traffickers, he decided not to use a gun for safety reasons and opted for bow and arrow for hunting. After searching, he found a good shelter, a natural cave in the rock wall with some paintings indicating past campers. However, upon inspection, he felt the cave might collapse at any moment. For safety, he decided to set up a tent on stable ground instead. Once his shelter concerns were addressed, it was time to hunt. Although commonly called pigs, Sierra pigs are not actually part of the pig family. They have tusks sharp as spears, but their hoofprints are very similar to those of wild pigs. Stephen soon discovered tracks, a morale-boosting sign that he was within the Sierra pig's range. He reached a high point and began observing from above. Stephen was patient, but as the sun set, he hadn't spotted any game and had to pack up and head back to camp for the night. Tonight, he would have to settle for freeze-dried food. However, this unexpectedly inspired him. He figured out a new way to approach eating the local delicacies. The next day, he arrived early at yesterday's observation spot, hoping to catch the Sierra pigs feeding. Unfortunately, thick fog obscured his view and disrupted his plans. Now, he had no choice but to roam around and try his luck. Sierra pigs are most active in the early morning and at dusk, their feeding times, and they are not picky eaters. While pondering, he noticed some fresh tracks on the ground. Following them, he came upon a rocky area dotted with many caves, some with recent signs of fire. Nearby, he found more evidence, including the remains of a Sierra pig. As he examined the bones, he jokingly asked them where their mates had gone. After playing around, he continued on his way. Knowing that Sierra pigs have poor vision but sharp hearing, Stephen walked slowly to make as little noise as possible. Soon, he spotted a small puddle with fresh Sierra pig tracks. He looked around but saw nothing. He then moved to another high ground. Suddenly, he thought he heard a noise, like the sound of chewing. Following the sound, he spotted several Sierra pigs feeding. Stephen approached from downwind and got closer. As he readied his bow and arrow, the pigs remained unaware, and he shortened the distance between them. Just as Stephen was about to shoot, one of the pigs sensed danger. It shook its seductive bottom and dashed off, leaving a frustrated Stephen in the breeze. He had missed a great opportunity and could only follow slowly, looking for another chance. Persistence pays off, and eventually he got a face-to-face encounter with a Sierra pig. He couldn't miss this chance. He drew his bow in one fluid motion and decisively shot the arrow. Wounded, the pig ran off crazily. Stephen went to the spot where the pig had been standing and found the arrow with blood on it. More blood was dripping on the ground. He decided to lie down and let the pig run for a while. After it bled for over an hour, it would naturally succumb to blood loss. When enough time had passed, Stephen got up to take action. He followed the blood trail persistently until he found the Sierra pig lying on the ground, blood oozing from its mouth, dead beyond doubt. Stephen was ecstatic. He opened the pig's mouth to reveal its sharp tusks, looking terrifyingly formidable. The thought of having hunted such a fierce beast with a bow and arrow filled him with deep pride. The Sierra pig's claws were also peculiar, featuring 2 bendable nails, and even stranger was a scent gland on its back, earning it the nickname skunk pig when it encountered danger. After reflecting on this, it was time to process the kill. He took out a small knife, slit open the pig's belly, removed the organs, and then strapped it to his backpack, happily starting his return journey. Next came the part he most anticipated, preparing the meal using an ancient Native American cooking method he had only read about in books and was trying for the first time. He started a fire and collected some porous lava rocks, placing them in the fire. He then cut a prime piece of pork from the game and removed the stomach, which he cleaned to use as a makeshift cooking pot. After preparations, he dug a hole in the ground and collected some cacti, arranging them around the hole. He placed the water-filled stomach in the hole and secured its edges with hooks to cacti to prevent slippage. He then sliced the meat and placed it inside. The key part of the cooking process was next. He poured the heated lava rocks into the stomach, causing the water to boil and cook the meat. This was essentially a Native American version of hot pot. As he watched the boiling scene, he grew excited. When the water cooled, he added new rocks to maintain a high temperature. About 15 minutes later, he felt it was time. So he removed the rocks and made several holes at the bottom of the stomach to drain the water. Stephen tasted a piece of the meat, finding it tender and delicious. The pure, unadulterated flavor fascinated him, marking a perfect end to his hunting trip. Stephen felt very content. Stephen, a full-time hunter, had come to the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, a place devoid of human traces atop icy mountains, where a species of mountain goat lived, nearly unmatched by any predator. Their meat, tender and delicious, often attracted gourmet hunters. They were willing to take the risk. But in Alaska, non-local residents only have 2 legal options for hunting goats. One is being a licensed outfitter, and the other is being a direct relative of a local resident. Stephen met neither criterion, but fortunately, his brother Danny qualified. Together, they set off, parked their vehicle at the foot of the mountain, and then, fully equipped, they officially began their ascent. Due to Danny's busy schedule, they could only spare 2 days for this trip. Therefore, they planned to return on time, regardless of whether the hunt was successful. The mountain was steep and covered with thick brush. To save time, they needed to figure out a route up the mountain. Just as they took out their binoculars, they unexpectedly spotted a goat midway up the slope. They were surprised since goats rarely come down to lower elevations. Stephen pulled out a higher precision binocular to try to determine the goat's gender. They were aiming to hunt a male. Unfortunately, the distance was too great to discern the gender through the lens. They decided to get as close as possible, but the mountain paths were steep, and they had to be extremely cautious since a few hunters fall to their deaths here each year. They forged paths through the mountains and built bridges over water, overcoming one obstacle after another, and finally crossed the thorny brush to reach the base of the peak. But the real challenge had just begun, as the rocks were covered with moss, making the paths slippery. They climbed by leaning forward, moving their feet slowly, and making sure each step was secure. After much effort, they reached a safe area and immediately used their binoculars to locate the goat they had seen earlier. Unfortunately, it was a female, and she had already spotted them. They had no choice but to continue climbing. The path ahead was covered in snow, slowing them down as they occasionally sank into it. They looked up and saw the goat now standing at the summit. At their current pace, it would take at least another hour to reach there. This demonstrated the goat's unique ability to navigate the terrain. After a brief rest, they continued climbing, but in the next few hours, they saw no more goats, and the sun began to set. Today's hunt had to end there, and they chose to spend the night outdoors. On the third day, after breakfast, they gathered their gear and climbed the mountain again. This time, they avoided the snowy areas and chose to walk through denser vegetation. After trekking for several miles, they finally spotted a goat walking along a dangerous cliff. They quickly took out their binoculars and observed that there were 4 goats in total, including one male. To reach them, they needed to cross 2 deep gorges. After some planning, they began their approach. They checked the situation across from them after every stretch of distance. Although the goats remained in their original spot, the situation seemed tense because the goats were looking over at them. It was clear they had noticed the 2 humans and were on edge. So, Stephen and Danny did not make any sudden moves, staying where they were, trying to ease the goats' suspicions. Although within shooting range, they chose not to fire without certainty. A hasty shot could send a goat tumbling into the opposite cliff, making retrieval difficult. After waiting for a while and finding no better opportunity to approach, they decided to circle around and try approaching the snowy mountain from another direction. When they reached the spot, they began observing the mountain. Through a thorough search, they confirmed the target goats were still there, allowing them to proceed with lighter gear. After reorganizing their equipment, they resolutely began the climb. Knowing the difficulty of climbing snowy mountains only became real when faced directly. They had only climbed for a short while before they were out of breath. However, the good news was they were very close to the goats, and the animals had not yet detected the danger. Now, they had a great chance of success. Stephen was ready to shoot when Danny urgently stopped him. He felt something was off about the male goat they targeted. Though it was bulky, its horns were too thin, resembling those of a female. Stephen, with his years of hunting experience, had to accept the reality that all the goats they were targeting were females. This was a disappointing outcome after such efforts. Feeling almost tearful, they watched as the goat stood at the highest point, expressionless, as if silently mocking them. Stephen felt like shooting one in frustration, but his rational mind urged restraint. Reluctantly, they packed up their gear and began the return journey. Hunting is sometimes like this, not always going smoothly, which is part of its charm. Until the very last moment, you never know what the outcome will be. Stephen is not only a hunter, but also a gourmet. He values the freshness of ingredients, so he often hunts in the wilderness and prepares food on site to satisfy his palate. This time, he was in southeastern Montana, where the animals are 3 times the size of a regular deer, but with tastier meat. Everyone who has tried it gives it a thumbs up. Stephen had lived in Montana for 10 years and knew the area well, including where to find such game. This time, however, he was not alone, but joined by his brother Matt and his friend Mosan. For this trip, Matt had prepared a transport team, all members being alpacas, suitable for the rugged, mountainous terrain. Vehicles were unusable, so they relied on alpacas to transport supplies. After a successful hunt, the alpacas would also carry the deer meat. After walking a few miles, it got dark, and they camped overnight, spending a memorable evening. The next morning before dawn, they got up early and each chose a direction to start their hunting journey, leaving the alpacas at the camp. Stephen planned to walk along the mountain ridge, hoping to encounter elk. After some searching, he noticed deer tracks all over the snow and carefully identified a reindeer trail, which he followed to a high point. From there, he used his binoculars for a better view from above and was lucky to spot 2 moose quickly. Stephen, trying to contain his excitement, set up his rifle. However, a female moose stood in front of the male, preventing him from taking a shot without risking harm to her. His opportunity came when the female walked away, but just as he was about to shoot, the male followed her, causing Stephen to miss his chance again. While Stephen continued looking for another opportunity, a magpie landed on the male moose's back, creating a surreal and amusing scene. Suddenly, the alert male sensed something unusual and, along with the female, left the scene. Stephen, disappointed yet amused by the scene, felt a chill as the window for a shot closed when a coyote disrupted the moment, intensifying his frustration. However, as he continued his search, fortune turned and he spotted 3 more deer. Just as he was about to act, a cold wind picked up and the deer vanished into the thick bushes. Stephen guessed the male was probably still behind the ridge and decided to circle around to the side for a better chance. Despite the obstacles, he finally reached his destination and used his binoculars for a closer look. As Stephen slowly approached, he saw only 2 female deer, with the male nowhere in sight. Continuing his search, his persistence paid off, and he spotted the male again. But perhaps his movements were too noticeable, scaring the male away, leaving only falling snowflakes where the moose had been. This left Stephen frustrated, feeling that a day's effort was wasted as the evening grew darker. He had no more chances to hunt and had to return to camp. The next day, the weather worsened, with snow falling and visibility dropping significantly. It was not ideal hunting weather, but facing challenges is part of a man's nature. The journey to find deer was difficult due to the heavy snow, but it also had a benefit. It was easier to distinguish the freshness of tracks in the snow. Stephen spotted some messy tracks that he could tell were from today. Following these tracks, he indeed found several deer. Positioned downwind and with the fog, he could confidently pursue them. As he got closer, he slowly raised his rifle. The male deer had not yet sensed the danger. Suddenly, Stephen took the shot. With the sound of the gun, the male deer fell, stunning the nearby female deer. The strong male had collapsed instantly. After calming his excitement, Stephen returned to camp, brought over an alpaca, and hurried to transport the deer back before its body froze. After a short delay, the deer was covered with a thick layer of snow. Stephen quickly took out a knife and began to butcher the reindeer. There was a tarsal gland on the deer's hind leg, emitting a strange smell, so he removed it first to prevent the gland from contaminating the meat and giving it an odd taste. He then sawed off the bones and cut a small piece of tender meat from near the spine, one of the tastiest parts of the deer, perfect for eating on the spot. He then packed the deer meat into categories and, leading the alpaca, started his return journey, feeling particularly content, not just because of the successful hunt, but also because he had won a competition. Next came the part he most looked forward to. He sliced the meat and then used snow to fill a pot for melting into water for cooking. He also prepared various side dishes, peeled them, and added them to the pot along with some spices, slowly stewing them into a thick soup. After some time, Matt also returned with a full load. Smelling the cooking stew, he couldn't wait for the meal. As night fell, the 3 men gathered around the fire, opening a feast with the venison. They cut open the hip bone, took out a piece of tender meat, and used snow as fresh water. They added potatoes, carrots, and other vegetables to the pot with the deer meat, making a delicious stew. Stephen, a full-time hunter and a gourmet, had come to southwestern Wisconsin, home to a species of cottontail rabbit known for its tender meat. The flavor was excellent, and his targets included deer and squirrels, planning to create a mixed meat stew and host a culinary feast. Stephen visited his friend's farm. Doug's family had thrived in this area for generations, owning the nearby mountainous woods. Under his careful management, the population of white-tailed deer had grown rapidly, but each spring, their numbers needed to be controlled to prevent them from becoming a nuisance. This time, he invited Stephen to join him in this task. The experts were ready to go. The plan was simple. 5 people would enter the woods to drive out the deer. Doug and Stephen waited in the open area below. They quickly arrived at their destination and each found a spot to settle down. Meanwhile, the other group of 5 had also taken their positions, and slowly walked into the pine forest. After waiting a moment, a large group of white-tailed deer burst out. Stephen immediately raised his rifle, but the deer ran so fast that he couldn't find a moment to shoot and could only watch them escape. Now, all hope rested on Doug. "Oh, damn," he muttered as he saw the sudden appearance of the deer. Doug was caught off guard, but lucky as 4 deer stopped briefly. After aiming, he pulled the trigger. With the gunshot, the deer scattered in panic. But Doug was confident he had hit one. He walked forward and informed the others of the situation. They began searching, and ultimately, Doug found the target. The male deer was already lying on the ground. Hearing Doug's call, everyone gathered to admire the catch, a mature, robust buck. They decided to process the deer on the spot. With a knife, they quickly gutted it and removed the organs, then dragged the deer away, successfully completing the first phase of their task. Next, they planned to hunt cottontail rabbits. As the temperature rose, the rabbits became more active. Different prey required different weapons, so the group changed their firearms and loaded ammunition before heading into the wilderness. Rabbit tracks were everywhere in the bushes. They boldly walked into the area, using brute force to drive the rabbits out. A rabbit sprinted out, and Doug, quick and ready, fired 2 shots, but missed as the rabbit sped away. Watching this amusing scene, everyone laughed, making it a joyful team activity. In the time that followed, gunshots rang out continuously as everyone tried to showcase their shooting skills, with visible rich results accumulating. Not to be outdone, Stephen demonstrated his prowess, almost achieving perfect accuracy with each shot, rapidly proving his skills within a short time span. They had caught 8 rabbits, completing the second phase of their task. Now it was time to clean the rabbits, skin them, chop the meat into pieces, and store it. Stephen wanted to taste more types of meat, so he set his sights on squirrels. Armed, he and Doug set out. The squirrels were active in a small grove. Stephen mimicked squirrel calls, hoping to lure them out. After waiting a while, and only seeing a few cows pass by without any squirrel sightings, the two went deeper and waited under a tree. Soon, a squirrel appeared, attracted by the imitation calls, and headed in their direction. Doug aimed his gun, waited for the squirrel to come closer, and decisively shot it down, then couldn't help but smile charmingly. Stephen generously praised him as they collected their first squirrel of the day. Their luck continued, and as more squirrels appeared, Doug took 2 shots at a target and finally killed another squirrel. With 2 squirrels, they had enough and returned home with their catch. Stephen prepared the squirrels and then moved on to cooking. First, he marinated the ingredients. He poured equal amounts of apple cider vinegar and water into a bucket, adding spices, salt, and chopped onions. After mixing well, he put the rabbit and squirrel meat in to marinate overnight. The next day, as the sun rose, Stephen got busy. After a night of marinating, the meat was flavorful. He wiped off the surface moisture, coated the meat in flour, and fried it in oil. Once flipped, it turned golden brown, looking and smelling delicious. Stephen enjoyed the cooking process. After frying all the meat, he added some broth and boiled it down on high heat to enhance the flavor. To cut through the richness, he prepared some onions. As the stew was nearly ready, to thicken the sauce, he took some ginger snap cookies, crushed them into crumbs, and added them to the pot. With this, the first dish was ready to serve. Next, he prepared the second dish. He and Doug went to the barn where a deer was hanging. They quickly butchered it, and Stephen picked some tender meat from the hind legs, marinated it with spices, then took it outside to grill on a rack.
While he was busy, the others sat on the couch, chatting and waiting. Their patience was rewarded with a delicious dinner arriving in succession. They eagerly tasted it, finding the flavors exceptionally pleasing. This way of eating was a new experience for them, highly enjoyable, making them feel as if they had truly lived only half their lives before. Today, they finally tasted real gourmet food.